cop checks house of old lady not seen for days. Here's Morse code behind door. It was a bright sunny morning for the police department as Jared, or as his newfound job title would identify him, Officer Jared, walked into the police station in a crisp, pristine uniform and a cup of steaming Americano in his hands. Today was going to be an amazing day. Jared wouldn't make errors and he would not take his colleagues' criticism personally. He calmly got into the creaking chair at his work desk and switched on his computer monitor. But as you might have guessed by now, Jared's fate had always been funny and embarrassing to him at the most inappropriate moments. "Damn, oh no, God!" he cried minutes later, inadvertently knocking the coffee cup over on the case files that lay on the table. Jared's colleagues burst into laughter and couldn't get enough of mocking the man. Poor Jared was bullied again. He scrambled to wipe the table, and when he tossed the coffee-stained paper tissues in the trash, tears welled up in his eyes. This wasn't how he pictured his life as a cop. Jared's late father was in the police force too, and he had instilled the value of protecting and serving the country in him. As a kid, Jared would dress himself up in his father's oversized police uniform and cap and admire himself in the mirror. "There's no doubt about that, young man. You'll make a brave officer someday," he'd say. And Jared's father would smile, assuring him that he would. But his words turned out to be only partially true. Jared did become a cop, but he wasn't a brave one. He was an insecure young cop who'd recently joined the force. His colleagues often said he was better off working at a grocery, but Jared was bent on proving them wrong. He had dreamed of becoming a cop like his father after all. Unfortunately, the more he attempted to prove himself, the more he failed and got into problems. He once cuffed a young teen following an older lady, mistaking him for a thief trying to steal her expensive purse. When the older lady spotted him taking the kid, she charged at him, aggressively poking and twisting her cane into his stomach and smacked him with her handbag. "He's my nephew," she growled. "Get lost, you incompetent cop." The other time, Jared arrested a man for breaking his neighbor's lock, and it turned out the neighbor had asked him to do it and get their kitty out after accidentally locking her inside. That's the kind of mess Jared had created since joining the station. So while his colleagues were working on serious cases, he was looking for missing cats and dogs and assisting elderly residents in the town and safeguarding their trash from raccoons. As Jared walked back to his desk from the trash can, he contemplated if he was cut out to be a cop. What had he achieved since day one of joining the line of duty? Nothing noteworthy after all. Suddenly, the station phone rang, jolting Jared out of his depressed "my career is as doomed as a cop" thoughts. Senior Officer West answered the phone as usual. Officer West called out and Jared turned to face him. "There's a lady, Mrs. Barrera. Her neighbors haven't seen her in 3 days, it turns out. They're guessing she's missing, although they hardly ever saw her leaving the house. Would you mind accompanying Ryan and checking on her?" Jared smiled and brushed his tears away. He was actually looking forward to his first case involving a human, not cats or dogs or raccoons littering the trash this time. You know these old folks. She's probably sleeping in her basement or something and didn't notice the doorbell ring. We've seen similar cases before, haven't we? Come on, West, I got another important case and I need you on it too. Send this fool alone." "Look," Officer West explained, "I'm your senior and I never boss you guys around, but this woman who called me seemed uptight and she said they usually saw Mrs. Barrera watering their plants in the garden. She hasn't done it in 3 days and she isn't answering the door, and the neighbors have reported hearing unusual knocks and movements in the house." The two cops then drove to older Mrs. Barrera's house, which had a wide lawn, pristine white picket fences, and a lovely porch. "This lady has called the station several times," Jared said quietly, looking out the car window at the house. "I know her," Jared said as he turned to face Officer Ryan. "This lady who called us at the station, she once asked us to find her lost cat, but the cat was simply lurking in the bushes. I found the cat for her. Days later, she ran away again, and this time I found her in the bushes again, dead." Dejected, Jared went to check on Mrs. Barrera by himself. He first knocked on the neighbor's door who had called the station and expressed concern about the older lady. She said Mrs. Barrera had never missed a single church service, but that Sunday she didn't show up at church and hadn't watered the plants in her garden since that day. As Jared climbed the steps to the front porch of Mrs. Barrera's house, he looked around. Nothing appeared to be wrong. Everything was in place and the house lights were on, indicating that the house wasn't empty. Jared rang the doorbell and knocked on the door. Suddenly, Jared heard a weak thud. He pressed his ear to the door and heard several such faint thuds. Something was very wrong. "Mrs. Barrera, is that you?" he asked, and there was a thud again. Jared knew what to do. "Okay, Miss Barrera, we're gonna play a little game here, alright? Just knock, or do the thud thing if you can hear me." There was a thud. Good, okay, good. "Now, are you in trouble?" There was another thud, but before Jared could ask another question, there were several thuds and scratching sounds, as if someone was dragging something across the floor. "What's that?" Jared asked himself. He listened to the pattern intently and his brows arched when he realized what it was. "Mrs. Barrera," he cried, "is that a Morse code? Are you using the thuds as dots and the scratching as dashes?" There was a thud. "Okay, Miss Barrera, now what you're gonna do is repeat the pattern from the very start, okay? I got a tissue in my pocket and He hastily pulled out a tissue and a pen. "And I'm gonna write that down, okay?" Jared gave Mrs. Barrera some instructions and jotted down the dots and dashes she was trying to indicate. His heart beat fast when he looked at the tissue after finishing his writing. Help was what Mrs. Barrera was trying to say. She was in danger. Jared immediately called Officer Ryan for help, but the senior cop wasn't ready to listen to him. "Mrs. Barrera's in danger. She's asking for help in Morse code," and Jared just hung up and dialed the paramedics. Officer Ryan jumped out of his cruiser and ran up the steps to Mrs. Barrera's house enraged. He would have probably said a few more hurtful things to Jared if the man hadn't asked Mrs. Barrera additional questions and received responses and thuds before the sound stopped. When the two officers broke Mrs. Barrera's door, they found her unconscious in the middle of the living room with her old cane beside her. Fortunately, paramedics arrived on the scene just in time and Mrs. Barrera was taken to the hospital. The doctor said that if they'd waited any longer to bring her there, the results would have been disastrous. Mrs. Barrera had broken her hip a few days ago and was so weak she couldn't even get up. Due to the pain, she could barely speak, and since the door was way out of reach, she couldn't answer it. Thankfully, she knew what Morse code was and could do it using her cane. But by the time they broke open the door, her strength gave out and she fainted. Jared decided to visit Mrs. Barrera and was taken aback when he ran into the head of the state police department who was also visiting her. What surprised him the most was when the senior officer approached him and shook hands with him. "Thank you for saving my late colleague's mother, officer," he said. "You must have seen Officer Barrera's photo at our police department," he added, seeing Jared's puzzled expression, and Jared nodded. "Officer Barrera sacrificed his life in the line of duty. Mrs. Barrera's been living alone since his death and none of her family members visit her. She's the late Officer Barrera's mother. I feel awful. I haven't been able to check on her often either, but you made us proud today. You saved her life. Thank you," he added, and Jared's cheeks flushed red. "I simply did my job, sir," Jared said politely. "Your father would be very proud of you, Jared," the police chief suddenly said. "I knew him. His son followed in his footsteps and became a good officer like he'd always wanted. Keep it up, Jared." Jared almost teared up. He'd never imagined he would receive such praise or medal for his act a week later. After Mrs. Barrera was discharged from the hospital, Jared visited her one day and was surprised to find the head of the police department there again. Little did Jared know the police chief would disclose something that would shock him. "Sir, I didn't expect to see you here," Jared said, and his senior couldn't look him in the eyes. He then revealed to Jared he was Mrs. Barrera's nephew and felt ashamed about not visiting her often. "You sorta opened my eyes, Jared. I kept putting off visiting her because of my work. After what happened, I realized I could have lost her. I want to make it up to her and visit her more often." Jared felt terrible for Mrs. Barrera and began visiting her from time to time, bringing her food and helping her around the house. He sometimes joined his senior and over time they became friends. During one of their visits, Mrs. Barrera revealed her late son taught her Morse code, which saved her life and turned Jared's career around. Since the incident, everyone in the department has praised his bravery and grown to admire and appreciate the brave and confident cop Jared is now. He's no longer the laughingstock, and he has indeed made his late father proud.